the absurdity of this film, which was made in the height of the Cold War, and today, why are we still in the same place?
Well, you know, what's quite amazing, actually, is we're in some ways the same place, in some ways a very different place. So at this time, when the film was made, it was obviously the US and the Soviet Union. And we were just beginning to lay out the frameworks of what would become a terrifying arms race, but also arms control regime. So we were, when this movie was made, about 4 years from the opening up for signature the NPT agreement, which is kind of the foundation of arms control today. And it was the beginnings of difficult times, many of you remember them, but it was also of trying to figure out how we were going to manage this absurdity, and how could we create deterrence, and how could we create hotlines and all of this to reduce the likelihood. And today, what's obviously a striking difference is we have 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and many who are expressing considerable interest, and groups who are as well. And so the difference now is, in addition to many of the similarities, we still have these 2 actors, but we're talking about today, reference to North Korea, obviously, where we don't have the decades of this kind of experience of where we're at now, where they're developing weapons at a significantly faster pace than we imagine in terms of their technologies and their abilities. And we really, really don't understand him, the leader there. And from, if anyone read the Evan Osnos piece, and I think it was the New Yorker, they don't really understand us. So part of the jokes of this was that we were talking with Dimitri, but we did have that effort, and we did have back and forth figure out. So in some ways, this time is considerably more dangerous in that the weapons we were talking about, there were so many of them, and they were so powerful. So we're talking about the hydrogen bomb. We were about 10 years into having hydrogen bombs, the power of them. And the numbers. So what we were producing with the Russians at this time, the Soviets, were so many warheads. And so, you know, we reach a period about less than 10 years after this film, where we've got about 70,000 nuclear warheads on the planet. And now we're below 10,000. Still way too many. And in many ways, they're more dangerous in terms of how many you can load onto warhead, how many warheads you can. They're MIRV. They're more difficult, more powerful, but they're still significantly less than at this time. However, now we have, as we're watching the North Koreans really kind of move faster in their own kind of technologies, and so it's a different world, and it's one that we don't have frameworks for, and we have leaders who are not playing by the playbooks, and who are trying to kind of out-threaten the other one in a time where, at least at this period, we had some hope that they would kind of pick up hotlines and be talking to each other.
Well, given the nuclear arsenal that's currently in the United States, what are your thoughts about the $1 trillion that's going to be spent to have our nuclear arsenal upgraded, and the fact that we have an inventory which is already deployable? So is the efficiency of this merely technical, or is there some kind of nationalistic agenda involved?
No, so actually they provide kind of 2 opportunities actually for all of us to get involved. And there's several places you can get involved. So we think about kind of nuclear arsenals, we think about these kind of things that there's nothing we can do, and actually you've raised something, a few things that we can do. So what you're referring to is we are about to embark on a $1 trillion investment in upgrading our nuclear arsenals. And I think what everyone, well, I wouldn't say everyone, but I think most watchers would say some investment in our nuclear arsenal is very, very smart. We want to make sure that it's safe, it's efficient, it will do what we think it's going to do, it won't, we don't want to rust our way to disarmament, right? You need to keep these things safe. A lot of these things still are on floppy disks. That's probably not where what we want. And so some sort of investment in modernizing our arsenal is responsible. The difference comes into, beyond that, what's responsible. And this is where the debate in the community, those who are watching it. There are some who feel that we really need whole new systems. And so for many of us, when we look at the investments being made, what we're concerned about is it looks like it's the creation of whole new arsenals and whole new weapon systems that will require testing. And we'll go back to this period of testing nuclear weapons we haven't tested in decades. But if you're going to create new weapons, you've got to test them. And so there's a lot of concern in terms of the investments being made that you're actually creating new arsenals. You're not reducing your ability. So where we can get involved is when you have your decision makers kind of in front of you, you can ask them what they're thinking about in terms of how we're going to invest our tax dollars, whether or not what their votes are and what they anticipate in terms of where our money should go. So that is a place where right now it's a pocketbook issue. You did hear the president say during the campaign that we were behind, that we needed to invest. Anyone looking at that, that's not really true. He seemed to say that we needed to double down on our investments, either not understanding that we were already about to make pretty big investments or else wanting to double down. So it wasn't clear he knew actually what he was saying, but either way it wasn't reassuring. What you also will see in the newspaper as you scan through or pick up or however you read the news is that there's also the thought that we actually need to make these things smaller. They're so big that you can't use them, and so they're unusable. And so the idea is if you could make them smaller, you would have a ladder where you could show intent that you were willing to use them, and it would make them more flexible. And so there's a move towards smaller nuclear devices. We at the Bulletin think this is a terrible idea. The whole point is to make them unusable. That once you start going up the ladder, there's no telling of how you escalate. And so making them more usable is kind of against everything that we've been working towards, and requires violations of existing treaties which are being violated. So to your point, we're about to make a huge investment. And to me, there's an opportunity of insisting when we're talking to our representatives that we raise these issues about where our representatives are going to come down on that issue.
So they're using floppy disks. Is it Windows 95?
They are using floppy disks. Like some people actually think that good thing they're using floppy disks because given what's going on with hacking and cyber, maybe we want them on floppy disks. But I don't think that actually, that there really is a concern that you want to make sure that these things aren't 1960s technology in 2017.
So for a while, disarmament was part of the dialogue, right, or part of the rhetoric, which was very difficult to many, many years, very slow movement. And then what kind of derailed this? Was this the smaller nations like Pakistan, for example, getting nuclear weapons that in a way threw this off kilter, this whole thing that they were no longer just two adversaries, that wasn't just the US and Soviet Union?
No, I think what really derailed it is the end of the Cold War happened, and it all seems like old stuff, right? It's like that's kind of Cold War. I speak to high schoolers, and the examples we talk about, we showed a film, Eric Schlosser's film, and it was all taking place in the 1980s, and for me, that's like, oh look, there's a young Bill Clinton, and oh, Ted Koppel was so young, but there was no reference point to it. We haven't been talking to our kids about, thankfully, we're relieved it's over. We got to the end of the Cold War, it was the peace dividend, and that was behind us, and we're focusing on other things. Happily, the conflicts weren't at the level that we're talking about now. So I think just current events change. And so at organizations like mine, for the last 20 years is how do we kind of engage the public on this because it's still so dangerous. We're on hair trigger alert. We are ready to go, right? So how do we get our weapons off hair trigger alert so that it would actually take time to get a missile ready? But we're on hair trigger because we're still in this world of, we want to make sure that if something's coming in, we can respond. So how do we kind of keep that focus when we've gone through all this where we haven't had, right? Now it's different, in some ways we're all seeing what's on the news, and so we're engaged, and we just have to make sure, kind of get up to speed. And so we actually have an exhibit down at the Museum of Science and Industry that we partnered with for 2 years, and it's fascinating, but you can watch the teenagers coming through it, and they're pretty engaged. They're like taking this in, they kind of get it. That this is something they want to learn about. We see this incredible interest. But you see the adults coming through, and they're either doing two things. They're like, oh, right. I remember that. Or they're like, where are we? Why are we still talking about this, right? They're just trying to catch up as fast as they can. So I just think the world changed. We didn't really have to think about this. And now you're screening this. We feel we need to relearn all this, unfortunately.
Should we open the floor for questions from the audience?
I was just wondering, what's your opinion of mutually assured destruction, though? That it's distasteful, you don't like the idea, but it works. That's what prevents other countries from attacking the United States.
Yeah, I
they'll
can't.
be destroyed.
So I will tell you, many of my colleagues really think it's crazy. I don't. So if I believe it actually has helped us in this. The reason we haven't tried to gotten to this point is we do fear the response and we understand it. What I do worry about is miniaturizing these so that we can walk up an escalation ladder with them. I don't see how that escalation ladder doesn't end up like this. I don't see how if you use it at one, take out a small city, that you're not going to get a response, or you're going to take out a bunker that you don't get a similar response and you don't build your way up. Now, what I do encourage with students is we need new thinking on this, right? There's new weapons coming on in new countries, and so we actually need kind of younger minds helping us figure out what is the mad for a 9-nuclear world. What does that look like? How do we think about it in an India-Pakistan context? What do we think about that with North Korea? How do we use our allies in the region? What do we need? So I am not opposed to it. I just think we're in a different world right now, and we really are still with kind of Cold War thinking in a post-Cold War world.
Excuse me, the small weapons already exist, however. I mean, we have artillery-based nuclear weapons. So somebody's talking about developing smaller ones. They're already small enough to fit in an artillery shell.
Yeah, they're trying to
Had
make
those for 30 or 40
They're trying to
years.
make them more usable. You'll remember during the Bush administration, we were thinking about how you build the nuclear bunker busters, and there's a whole kind of looking at what new can we do and how can we build them. So in my mind, this is not where we should be investing our money. I think that we can figure out other ways to do it, and we want to try to make these as unusable as possible.
The small ones are already here, I think that's the point.
Yeah, but I think the point is what's coming. And in terms of
Even
where we're going to
smaller?
make our investments. Well, in terms of what we're putting onto submarines, what we're doing in terms of a whole host of new weapons coming.
You consider North Korea that a threat to the United States, where we must attack on just a notion and not to see, nuclear coming, but basically it's just, you consider it as an ally or a threat?
Oh, I think North Korea is a threat, and I think we're a threat to North Korea.
Okay.
The doomsday clock is like 2.5 minutes now. What does that mean?
Please interpret.
Yeah, well, so we meet every year, and the doomsday clock has changed over time. So in 2000, what it means, what 2.5 minutes to midnight means, is if you look across our history, it's never been closer than 2 minutes to midnight. It's never been as far away as 17 minutes to midnight. And, or it's been as far as 17 minutes to midnight. And so one of the messages that our organization thinks it means is we're moving in the wrong direction. It is a very dangerous world, and that we are really close to, and closer than we have been to destroying life on Earth as we know it. And so part of going back to your question, which is where are we now? Over the past few years, the situation in our mind has been getting increasingly dangerous. And where we are right now was kind of anticipated at the beginning of the year. And so we think it's moving in the wrong direction and getting very dangerous, and we're getting closer to nuclear detonation, and this is what is a pretty controversial decision. In 2007, we added climate change to the discussion, believing that if you're concerned about life on Earth as you know it, you have to take climate change into consideration and think about it. And so that was the debate. It had gone on for 10 years. It's still a debate now. Obviously, the difference between the two is different time spans, apples and oranges. But the question we ask our science and security experts is, are we safer or at greater risk now compared to last year and across history? And what time do you think it is based on that? And so we really think of where we are and where we've been and what message we want to send with it. We have leading scientists on a host of issues and security experts, and it's really they come together, it's a judgment at the end of the day, it's their judgment.
Me?
Yeah.
So you talked about how we're kind of on a hair trigger, and then in this film, they talk about how, they say right at the beginning, none of this could really happen, according to the U.S., but I'm sure so much stuff is unknown and confidential, but as far as your understanding of it, like what, and with all these different kinds of nuclear weapons being put into different forms, what could be a situation where somebody could authorize this or something? Like, what would be the most, what's a situation that's kind of like the least protected or scary with somebody authorizing this? That's kind of on a, like, really quick,
So there's a wonderful and very important film by Eric Schlosser just out where he talks about nuclear accident in Damascus, Arkansas in the 80s. It's kind of what I was referring to, that they were so young. And his point of this movie is, and it's based on his book, Command and Control, is there have been so many accidents and so many near misses. And that's what's so... you need the kind of being on hair trigger for deterrence to work, and yet it opens you up to the possibility of accidents. And so what Eric does is he kind of goes through in his book and just shows accident after accident, near miss after near miss. Now you talk to the physicists and they'll say, well, those near misses, we have so many fail safes in there that's why that even though you've had these accidents and you've dropped these bombs over our own territories, we've pierced these missiles, in their silos. We've had these examples, and they were near misses, but they didn't happen. So that's the good news, right? That they were built in such a way as to protect against things from happening. So, and if you haven't seen it, the movie's just really excellent. But there's a lot of worry about that, it still is the kind of the accidents. And if all of this happened here in the United States, like what's going on in Pakistan, right? Like how is it that you haven't had those accidents there and yet we haven't heard of them? This week, there was a Russian died who, you might have seen it in the paper, he got intelligence saying that there had been a U.S. attack. Their radars were picking it up. It was sun bouncing off clouds. And that's what they saw. And he just in the papers last week, right? His gut, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And so he made the right judgment. He didn't respond. But the orders were for him to respond. So I think that the concern on this and, the mistakes, and you can't build a doomsday machine if you don't tell anyone about it, deterrence won't work then, it's the mistakes. And so I know for Eric and that film, it was, we need to figure out how to mutually draw down. So, can't we go from 1,500 to 1,000? And most experts said that yes, you can still have mutually deterrent if you move from 15,000 to 1,000. You can do that. How can we keep doing that so you have a less chance of accident? You'll have Bill Perry talking about, former Secretary of Defense, talking about fewer weapons, fewer accidents, and things like that. So there's still concern about that. We don't have as many. So that's one. The other is that you end up in, conflict is all about the fog of war and the unexpected and unpredictable, and that's why you don't want to be in this position that we're in right now with the leaders making these kind of comments back and forth, is because it just makes accidents and unintended consequences more likely. So, I think right now it's really the unintended that we're worried about. After September 11th, there was a lot of concern about terrorism, what we know, kind of dirty bombs in our cities. There's been a lot of work on that. I don't think anyone would ever say like we're safe or we feel better, but there has, at least after 9/11, there was a lot of attention to trying to figure out how to create some systems and intelligence around it. So, but terrorism is always kind of an issue out. You can go on the list of things you worry about. Cyber. If you talk to folks there, they don't feel as vulnerable as they used to, although, every day it just feels like we're more vulnerable than we think. So, that you can kind of go through the risks, and there's a lot of them, obviously, but it's the more you have, the greater risk you have, and we probably don't need as many as we have, still.
Well, so the one thing that scares me is Donald Trump, and someplace I read this whole thing of the decision-making power of, in the case of the president getting really, really ticked off and making the decision, that actually there are not that many fail-safes necessarily that could stop him in case he decided, the Koreans really ticked him off.
So there's a second place where we can make a difference. There's a kind of a bill that's moving through. It's called the Markey-Liu bill. It's supported by Markey and Liu, and it seems so simple. It's that a president cannot issue an offensive use, a first use of nuclear warfare, unless there's an authorization of war by Congress. Which seems so basic, right? It's just like basic to our democracy, and yet we don't have that. Now, some strategists will say you can't have that because you need the ability to respond. If you hear that these are in the air, that someone's sending it over, we need that ability to respond. So that's why Markey-Liu is built in a way to say first use, that you cannot be the one to use it first unless there's an authorization of war. It seems like a very minor protection. It seems a no-brainer.
I'm just curious if, let's say, a terrorist organization got a hold of a nuclear bomb, and what are the chances that if they got it off, if they set it off, that would escalate to nuclear war worldwide? Or if it's just going to be like an isolated thing?
Who knows, because it hasn't happened. But in that situation, you're not having missiles coming in. So something's detonated in the city, right? And so the effort to try to figure out what that is. So what I would not expect is something happens and then all of a sudden we're shooting it off back at the Russians or something like that, right? That's not to say it wouldn't be devastation, and you see, we would respond on a war footing and trying to figure out who that is. But I mentioned Secretary Perry. He's one of the real kind of thought leaders on this. It is really his concern that that's how we're going to experience a nuclear attack, that it will come in through a container, through a terrorist organization, and detonate, in his mind, in Washington or somewhere else. And it just our way of life, that these nuclear weapons are very dangerous for us, both through accidents or what's coming in, and to be trying to figure out how to get this material out and safe and kind of away from some of these places.
What's your personal biggest worry of which way you think that's something?
My biggest worry right now is that are two. One is I see mostly the Russians violating arms control agreements and the breaking of kind of the what we expect them to do and the falling apart of our arms control regimes without new ones in place. I am very worried that we've got an old architecture for a new environment, and the weapons are new and they're developing, and our systems, our structure isn't handling it very well. And part of that is just trust and who's in charge in Russia. So I worry about that. And to me, this is what an arms race looks like, right? When you have the reverse, which we've been living through for right after the Cold War, where we were working together to remove these weapons and really coming down in terms of the numbers, and together putting pressure on countries that had them and removing material in dangerous fragile places. That's what it looked like when you began to unravel an arms race. But right now what we're seeing is each side investing because the other side is investing, and it has a logic. When you see what the Russians are doing and you see them testing their weapons and putting them into their drills, we have to respond. And so, kind of we respond the way we know how. And that's what an arms race looks like, and then you need more. And so how you begin to break that, part of that is why we're all here today, right? It feels very different. It doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel like it's working. It doesn't feel like the grown-ups are in charge. And that's where you got a lot of public pressure. My belief is that the public pressure didn't necessarily lead Gorbachev and Reagan to sign these arms control agreements that they did. It was when they decided for their own purposes that they needed to. They could turn over their shoulder, and the public was right there saying, let's do this. So I don't think we're in that position. I don't think if there was enormous pressure, like suddenly, the president would think differently about our nuclear arsenal, but we have to begin to put that pressure on. So when they do decide to get to that place where it's like, this is actually as dangerous for us as it is for them, and it's not making us safe, that there's public pressure to say, yeah, we agree.
Regarding these apocalypticians, do we test our weapons to make sure that they
No.
still perform their
We
assigned
simulate.
destructive?
We simulate. So we're simulating with computers. We're simulating in our weapons labs. That's really what our weapons labs do. We haven't been testing, and that's been part of our agreements and what we've agreed to do. And that's what's so nerve-wracking about some of the new advancements is you don't see how you can get to any sort of confidence without returning to testing, and that's yet another kind of falling away of the architecture that we've been living with.
Question back there?
Last week, there was something in the news that the generals, I believe, were discussing options with respect to North Korea, that there was a non-nuclear option, and they described them, it was described as kinetic options. I'd never heard that term used before, and I was wondering if you have any insight as to what, does that refer to these smaller tactical nuclear weapons, or?
No, a kinetic response is largely a conventional response. That it's a pretty common term. They have been using it, but that there's a kinetic response. There's a conventional response to this. We don't have to rely kind of on nuclear weapons. We can, right? The whole issue with North Korea, right? And it's what Steve Bannon was saying, like they got us, right? Is that that Seoul is vulnerable, that tens of millions will die, and we've got to kind of go in and find their nuclear weapons, and we won't be able to find them. So what they're saying is we can go in conventionally, and there's some options. Surprises a lot of people. Not sure what this looks like. I don't think there's a lot of confidence, but that's what they're trying to come up with, a situation where you don't end up with North Korea still launching some sort of nuclear weapons, either at their allies or at our allies.
Yeah,
I got a question.
Well, just to make this one statement. Last time you saw Dr. Strangelove, what are your thoughts then and now about the film?
Well, I haven't seen it in quite a while. And it seemed, right, you watch it because it was nostalgic, and now watching it, I think you're trying to figure out, like, where are the parallels? And like, what they're talking about in terms of the power of these weapons and the nonsensicalness of this, how how do we avoid, so I was actually kind of sitting there kind of thinking about what's different and what's the same. And the first time I saw it, it was more as a old movie,
Like
right?
like a satire and.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if we listen to our president, it's just, it's horrifying, and it's to the point to where I hope he doesn't have the last word, because we'll all be in trouble, and a lot of people will die, because this guy's just tweeting and tweeting every night, all night long. It's like he never gets any sleep. Who is his boss? Who is he listening to? Because I've never seen a president that had the world was so divided.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that gets back to your point, which is the president really has authority in our system. He has full authority. The Secretary of Defense can say no, but he can always fire the Secretary of Defense. So that is our system, and it's built for speed, and it's an enormous amount of responsibility on one person. So there, during the Nixon administration, when Nixon was kind of at the end of, I guess it was 1972 or so, and I guess it was Schlesinger who was kind of worried that he'd been drinking and he seemed kind of off his rocker a little bit, and he wasn't sure, and he started telling, commanders, don't, if he issues anything, you come to me, but that's completely out of chain of command. So that's only kind of revealed now, because that is not our system. This system is built for speed, for reasons we talk about with that, the Russians have to know that if anything comes up, we respond almost automatically, because that's what deterrence is about. But the flip side of that is it is the president has complete authority, and he is able to fire anybody who might be in that chain of command who says so. That's what was so troubling. That's what brought up a lot of these questions also during the election, because it didn't seem like that's what we were voting on in the past and what we're voting on.
Thank you very much, Rachel Bronson. Thank you to all of you for being here and for watching the film. Please carry the message forward. Thank you.